How much time should a pastor spend preparing sermons each week? That is a big question. I know that many of you prepare sermons every single week. Some of you perhaps do them many weeks throughout the year, and can be a bit of a controversial subject. So, Dad, how long did you, just out of curiosity, back when you were preaching regularly, do you remember how much time you spent?
I'd say 15 hours because everything was non-digital, and I would have concordances and commentaries and things just spread out over my table. It obviously got shorter and shorter with the digital world, and as we'll say in this podcast, with experience as well over time. But that's where I started, and particularly when there's a church of 7 members and then the family of 4 that came into it, which was then the Rayner family. It seemed you think about how much I spent per church member. That's a lot of time. But yeah, that was it at the beginning. I wasn't in the digital world.
I'm not in the digital world that much. I still use a lot of print versions of everything. We'll take a deeper dive into this subject here in just a moment. But I certainly want to thank our sponsor, Upward Sports. Upward is your partner as a bridge into the community. Nobody does it better. They can use sports ministry and recreation ministry as a way to train and equip your church to do gospel work. I absolutely love their programs. They can be customized to your church. You don't even need a gym. Gyms are great, and if you have one, you should use it, and you should call Upward. But even if you don't have a gym, they can help you. And Dad, get this. They are offering a grant. They are offering a 2024 sports startup grant of $500 to our listeners. That's incredibly generous. They sponsor the show and they're offering a grant. Really just can't say enough good about them. So go to upward.org/church answers, schedule your call, get that $500 sports grant. You can't go wrong with them. Again, upward.org/church answers.
So you know what I say about
okay.
Upward? Hey, you know what I say about Upward when people ask me? I said, Upward makes your church outward because it moves you to an outward focus. So get upward to get outward.
Yeah. Call Upward, get outward. There you go. I like that.
There you go.
I like that.
And just so that we don't interrupt the flow of the podcast, I do need to give my 60s reference, but it's really 1970. So if you'll allow me to just edge into the 70s, give me just a little more time. One Hit Wonder by the chairman of the board. So
the chairman of the board.
Mm-hmm. Chairman of the board. One Hit Wonder. Give me just a little more time and our love will surely grow. You want the rest of it?
No, I don't. I'm just curious about the name of the band. It's singular? Chairman? Is it just one person in the band? Why wouldn't it be the chair people or the chairmen?
That I don't know. I would have to Google that to find out. But it is a 1970 song. And by 1970, when the song came out, I was 15, so I was really too old to enjoy it anymore.
All right, back to the topic at hand.
How much time should a pastor spend preparing sermons each week? How about it, Sam?
Yeah, I'll just say this. You don't have unlimited hours, and you really can spend too much time in sermon preparation.
Heresy,
I've heard it said.
Heresy.
Listen, I have heard it said you can't. You can never spend enough. There's no way you can spend too much time preparing for your sermons. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say, absolutely, you can spend too much time preparing your sermons. You've got work weeks that are longer than just your sermons. You've got church members that you have to tend to. You have responsibilities that are beyond the sermon. Is the sermon important? Yes. Do I believe in the primacy of preaching? Yes. Is your sermon extraordinarily important? Of course. But it's not the only thing you do. So that means you have to set up some parameters as to how long you're going to spend working on your sermons. You don't have unlimited hours. Now, there's a poll. There's a poll that came out. 70% of pastors spend between 10 and 18 hours each week preparing a sermon.
I think that's fair. I mean, what's the definition of fair? I think it's accurate, and I think it's well placed stewardship of time.
I would say the majority of pastors are, it seems like, according to this poll, within the sweet spot of, the time spent preparing a sermon. Now, the way I do it, and this is certainly not the only way to do it, I dedicate Sunday afternoons for reading and research. So when I'm done preaching, lunch, and then sometimes I have meetings, but most weeks I'm right back into sermon prep Sunday afternoon. I know that's not for everybody, but that's how I do it. And then I write my sermon on Mondays, and I make myself get done by Monday. By Monday afternoon, Monday evening, I just say I have to be done with my sermon, and that's kind of how I control my hours. And it works really well for me because I'm usually 4 or 5 weeks ahead on my sermons, but it also enables me to have the rest of the week to do whatever else I need to do. So that's roughly 15 hours. So I would say I'm, depending on the text and the sermon and the topic, 10 to 15 hours is what I spend on
But
preparing my sermons.
you've got the rhythm of you have to prepare for your Sunday morning sermon, but then I've sat through many of these. You have a Wednesday night in-depth study as well. It's not sermonic, but it is detailed, and you usually bring a lot of detailed information to that Wednesday night presentation.
I do. And a lot of listeners can relate to this. When I started in ministry, it was Sunday morning sermon, Sunday night sermon, Wednesday night lesson, and I taught Sunday school as well. And every now and then I do a devotional throughout the week with some other groups. So 4 to 5 different
Yeah.
lessons, sermons, teaching times that I had to prepare for. And that was a lot. Now I am down to 2. I do Sunday morning and Wednesday nights. And my Wednesday night lesson, it's not as difficult to prepare because it's a group of about 75 people that are in my life group. That's a typical Wednesday night. We have other groups, but my group tends to be
Yeah,
the
you have four
largest.
or five
There's
hundred
about
on Wednesday
75
night,
people.
don't you? You got over
Yeah, no,
400.
my church will. Yeah. 400 is a normal, kind of a normal amount for us on a Wednesday night. That's kids, students, everything. But I've got my group that I teach to. But that's not as difficult because it is a little more laid back. It's not a sermon; it's a lesson, or it's teaching time. But it is detailed. You're right, and that can take 8 hours or so to prepare for. Again, depending on the text and the topic. So
Hey,
I am spending a total of 20 hours a week, roughly, doing those 2 different time slots, Sunday morning and Wednesday night.
your time on Wednesday night is roughly around an hour when it's all said and done after we sing a little bit. But what really is always fascinating with your Wednesday night time are how the prayer requests are articulated. Now, I'm not going to give some names, but I heard someone give 3 prayer requests not too long ago there. And oh my goodness, it was like they had the medical sheet in front of them and they were reading the symptoms, the problems, the prognosis, the prayers. Oh, my, and that was just on one person. And yeah, so
Yeah,
your prayer,
we'll get 15 to 20 prayer requests.
yes,
So, I like that time. I know that people make fun of your Wednesday night prayer meeting and everyone talks about, their third cousin that has a dog who died. But I love people. I love awkwardness and I love it when people are awkward. And there is no more awkward time than prayer time on Wednesday nights. And I eat it up. And that's why I do it. That's why I continue to do it. One, I love my people and I want to pray for them and it's important to pray for them. But I actually enjoy the weirdness of Wednesday nights. It's something I look forward to.
there's some consistency in the weirdness too, but I'm not going to get to that. We'll get back to the sermon prep time.
Yeah, I mean, this issue really is one of stewardship. You have a set amount of time and you have to steward that time. To say that you're just going to spend an unlimited amount of hours on a sermon or to spend too many hours on a sermon, you're actually getting into issues of stewardship. This is not an issue of faithfulness. It moves from, you do need to spend the time to preach a good sermon. That's an issue of faithfulness. But when you spend too much time, then it moves out of this issue of faithfulness into stewardship, and you're just not a good steward of your time. I'll just go on a limb. If it's 40 hours every week for a sermon, you're not stewarding your time well. You should not spend that much time on a sermon.
You are
There's no
neglecting.
good reason to
You're
spend
neglect.
40 hours a week on a sermon.
You're neglecting some pastoral ministry. Tell you that. You're neglecting family ministry. Tell you that. If you're spending 40 hours per sermon. So you're right.
Yeah, and there is this idea of, does that extra 10 hours really make your sermon that much better? I mean, you're at the margin on that point. And what I mean by that is putting in 10 hours versus 1 hour, there's a huge difference.
Yep.
Putting in 15 hours versus 10 hours. Okay, there's probably a decent amount of difference there. 20, 30, 40 hours, the amount, that amount of hours versus what it does to your sermon. Does it make it that much better? No, it really doesn't. 40 hours versus 25 hours, those extra 15 hours are not the same as the first 15 hours that you put in.
True.
Those are the ones where you see a lot of benefit. You can tell when somebody's like spent an hour preparing a sermon. You can just tell. But it's very difficult to tell the difference between this person spent 25 hours on a sermon, this person spent 40 or 45 hours on a sermon. The rate, the amount of improvement that occurs with those extra few hours on the end, it's just not a whole lot. And it's honestly, because you have other responsibilities, I don't think those extra 10 hours are worth it. I think it's better spent on doing something else.
Part of the issue, Sam, is I've had a number of students when I was a seminary dean and a professor who were influenced by the just preach the word. And it's not preach the word, it's just preach the word. In other words, that's all you really need to do. If you preach the word, your church is going to be healthy, your church is going to grow, it's going to care for people pastorally, and the list goes on and on and on. That may not be a pervasive type of philosophy that is out there, but that is one philosophy out there is, if you're not either preparing or preaching, you're probably not doing anything important. And that's out there at times.
It is. And those are trigger words for me. And maybe you did that intentionally. Whenever I hear just preach the word, I just want to be like, that is the worst advice you can give any young preacher / pastor. That is literally like the worst thing you can say, because what you're saying is your preaching is important and nothing else is, which is ridiculous. I understand when people say just preach the word, and what they mean is, hey, make the Bible the most important thing. Okay, fair enough. But
Sure.
I'm with you there. But if you say just preach the word, and what you mean by that is you can completely lead your church from the pulpit, you're in a whole lot of trouble. Like you can't lead your church just from the pulpit. You can't do that. And people won't receive it well. You won't even know your people. So I don't like the idea of just preach the word for many, many reasons. I think it's terrible advice. I think it's a horrible way to lead your church. And frankly, the guys that do that end up getting fired because they don't really connect with their people.
Exactly. Yeah, I was doing a consultation one time, and the pastor told me, he said, look, the reason I called you is this. I was given advice by Dr. Such and such, and that person told me that I just needed to preach the word. He was serious about it, and he didn't want me to do anything else. He said, part of the reason I got you here is I think I'm going to get fired unless we make some major changes, and you got to help me because of that. So,
well, there you go. Yeah. So you should spend somewhere between 10 and 20 hours on your sermon. It may be a more difficult text and require a lot more time, or it could be less time because you just really know this text well and you've preached it before. So there is some variation there, but I would say somewhere between 10 and 20 hours is a good sweet spot. Or if you look at the poll, 10 to 18 hours. And I think that's fair. But I'll also say this. If you are less experienced as a preacher, you're probably going to have to spend a little more time. And if you are more experienced as a preacher, you're probably going to spend a little less time. I've been preaching now for 20 years. So whether or not my sermons are good, I don't know, but I certainly know how to write a sermon. I can write, and I know what I'm doing at this point. So it doesn't require as much time as it did in the past. I'm just experienced. I've been doing it a long time. I've preached thousands of sermons. So, okay. I have that experience. If you don't, you may be more on the 20-hour side because you're just getting started. But the goal should not be, if you're on the high side because you're inexperienced, the goal shouldn't be to figure out ways to increase that time. Your goal should be, how can I make this, how can I be more efficient in my sermon preparation time? Because if I'm more efficient in my sermon preparation time, I have more time with my people, which is what you should be doing as a pastor. And I get that it's a balance. But what we are saying is 10 to 20 hours, somewhere between a quarter to a half of your week is spent in sermon preparation. That is likely the largest category of time that you're devoting to any one thing. So you really are dedicating a significant amount of time to your sermon preparation. And I know there's bivocational people listening going, 40-hour week, spending a minute, I got about 5 hours. That's about it to prepare my sermon because I'm bivocational. And I totally get it. When I was bivocational, it was late. I would go back to the office after working out, and I would write my sermons till 1, 2 in the morning at my
But
place of employment. So I hear you. I understand. I mean, this advice here is definitely slanted towards full time
but
people.
back to your original thesis, when you were bivocational, you were also inexperienced. So you had the double whammy of not having enough time because you had two jobs and because you were inexperienced. Therein lies the challenge for the younger pastor, not the bivocational part, but the inexperienced part. That younger pastor comes into a church, that pastor's going to have to get to know the people, the community. I remember the first time you called me when you were a first full-time church. You said, okay, I'm sitting in my office. What do I do now? I mean, you don't know how to do anything. I said, don't worry about it.
That's true. That really happened. You said your words were, "Give it a week, you'll figure it out." And sure enough, like the next week, I was like, "Man, I'm slammed. I've
Yeah.
got so much going on."
I said, you don't have to wait on, you won't have to wait long. So the point is, it's going to be a greater challenge for the young, inexperienced pastor because they are inexperienced in all areas, not just sermon prep, and they need to spend more time in sermon prep because they're inexperienced. Therein lies the challenge, but that's a real reality that they will be facing when they get out of seminary or Bible college or whatever the case may be. Let's talk about this 10% of
Yeah,
pastors.
and
Fascinating note.
yeah, and this gets back to, I think a lot of pastors are in a sweet spot. So hear us. We're not this podcast episode isn't so much about being prophetic and saying everyone's doing it wrong. Actually, I want to be encouraging and say most pastors seem to be doing this well. Only about 10% of pastors spend 6 hours or less in sermon prep, and just a small percentage of pastors are spending too little time. So
Right.
that's good news. Is this idea of, well, are pastors really preparing for their sermons? Well, yeah, they are.
They are.
And, there are, again, some pastors that may not have the ability or the luxury to spend more time. So I'll just look at the data and say that I think most pastors are giving the time in the word that they should be giving.
So this podcast is an affirmation for a lot of pastors right now. You're not too little, or you're not just right. We could call this edition the Goldilocks time of spending sermon preparation. Not too much, not too little. You don't get the, do you get the metaphor?
I do. And I'm humoring you as you sometimes humor me. But the last thing that I'll say is this. I have seen some boast about how much time they spend. I spend over 40 hours a week studying the word just to preach to my church. And I would say, okay, what you are bragging about is your own inefficiency. Just
Ouch, ouch, ouch.
yeah, if I'm just saying, if you're boasting about 40 plus hours every week in sermon prep, all that you're saying is you are a really inefficient pastor. You shouldn't be spending that amount of time every week. Again, preparing your sermons. So this is that balancing act of, you have several other pastoral duties. You have several other things that you should be doing along with your sermon preparation. Again, this is obviously talking mainly to full-time pastors. You're terribly inefficient if 40 hours is every week for you on sermon prep. You really should be figuring out ways to cut that back. And I think that's going to be helpful for the church.
Well, I think this podcast is probably going to be helpful for a lot of pastors, but it's not only going to be helpful for a lot of pastors. I think for the lay people, we have a significant audience of lay persons. I can't give you a precise number, but I know from the responses we had a lot of lay people listen to us, and they are going to get something from this podcast because they know that part of what their pastor does is not seen, but is sermon prep. And if y'all ever wonder what does the pastor do during the week, well, possibly the most significant time is in sermon prep. So keep that in mind when you're saying, I wish I had your job where you only have to work 1 hour a week. That's almost become too cliche to even say it.
Yeah, and thankfully, I think most parishioners and people who are members of a church, they understand. I know my church understands, and I don't think I would surprise anyone at West Bradenton if I said, yeah, about 20 hours a week between Wednesday and Sunday, between those two lessons, I'm spending about 20 hours a week preparing. I think most of them would say, yeah, that's about what we expect, and that's what we want. And I think that's just a healthy place to be. I know for me, yeah, it's about a little less than half the time in lesson preparation, a little more than half the time ministering to people. And for a lead pastor, the main teaching, preaching pastor, I think that's a good place for most people.
I think it is fascinating information, fascinating application, things that pastors can take with them right now and just say, okay, I might be doing some things right. I did one of the early studies on time that pastors spend each week in a 168-hour week. In my book, Surprising Insights from the Unchurched. The data is so old, I'm not recommending it to you, but that was the first time that I remember doing the entire 168 hours, like sleep, eat, time with family, etc. Had several categories, and I think, if I recall correctly, that the time that they spent in sermon prep would have fallen in this 10 to 18 hours. But I don't have the book in front of me, and I don't remember the research, so we'll see. Hey, speaking of time, it is time to introduce a contemporary translation of Scripture in Spanish. I've been waiting for this one. I mean, there are good Spanish translations out there, but now Tyndale is introducing the NTV Economic Bible Collection. By collection, we mean the different ways, the binders, the formats of it, but it's the same translation. What they've done is they get this accurate and powerful Spanish translation where they took it from the original text into clear contemporary Spanish. This is not something that is old. It is brand new. So if you have Spanish-speaking churchgoers, get it for them. If you have a Spanish-speaking congregation, get it for them. If you're like Sam's church and you have one of your worship services that is in Spanish, get it for them. Get it for those who are in your community that you can hand out, because they have all kind of NTV economic Bibles. So get this. It's an incredible opportunity to get the Spanish-speaking world into a contemporary translation that is also very accurate, but it's also an opportunity to go into the community if there's a lot of Spanish-speaking people and provide them a copy of the Bible. Thank you again for being a part of Rainer on Leadership. We continue to address these things every single week. We go from this week, where we're talking about how much time does a pastor spend in sermon prep, to next week we talk about, does doctrine and what you believe really affect church growth? Well, that's something we'll be looking at soon. So we'll see you in the next episode of Rainer on Leadership.